that's where they're measured. They feel that's where they've got to contribute most. Fuck. Do you think they've stopped now?
Hopefully.
My name is Craig Taylor, and you're listening to Truth Lies in B2B Tech, a podcast for anyone engaged in complex B2B sales. Along with my co-host James Ingham, we discuss the latest best practices in marketing, sales and service. In each episode, we take a go-to-market strategy, look at it through a technology lens, and figure out if it's worth your time. We'll always cut through the bullshit, no fluff, self-serving agendas or veiled pitches. Just honest insights from people who work in the trenches. Enjoy the show. So, topic for today is to talk through the best ways of combining your digital engagement with human-led interactions throughout the sales process. Very much focused on, obviously, our core area of interest, which is complex B2B sales. At face value, obviously, most complex sales are led by a human being, led by a salesperson.
Naturally so.
Or even a team of salespeople, depending on how big the opportunity is. But increasingly over the years, your engagement from a digital perspective has become more and more important, leading up to the latter stages of a sales process. And even now, as part of those latter stages of the sales process, digital can certainly contribute, particularly when there's a combination of human and digital in terms of that interaction, which we'll touch on in more depth. So I think we're going to talk through the problem when companies don't get this right. We're then going to talk about how you can make this work throughout the buyer journey and the steps that you can take to do that. And then before we close and summarize, we're going to talk about the different stages of the buyer journey and give some examples of how digital human interactions can combine for great effect. So we'll use some case studies, we'll use some examples of things that we've worked on, maybe things that we've seen work elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. So if we start with the problem of digital only interaction throughout the B2B buyer journey, what is it?
Well, I think the problem stems from a lack of consistency. And if you think about the different stages of the buyer journey, when you talk to people in either sales or marketing, but particularly marketing or even leadership, there's a real concern that it's just too complex to really think about. It's too hard to think about all the different stages of the buyer journey, all the different stakeholders that are involved, all their different requirements. And then and often marketeers will start to think about the volume of content and the variation of content that's needed throughout those different stages and to support the needs of those different stakeholders in a buying group. But I guess the reality is you're already doing a lot of it. It's just done in a very unstructured way. So you've already got a sales process, you're already creating content, but quite often it's not done in a way that's more strategically aligned to that buying process. And I think when you are doing these things in isolation and not joined up, and you're not thinking about how digital combines with human interactions, that's where the inconsistencies come from. And from a buyer's perspective, if you see an inconsistency, that creates doubt. If you're a buyer and you build a picture of a particular company online in terms of what it might do, what it might, how it might help you, the value it delivers, then when you have an interaction with the salesperson and that perception is very different, you're kind of thinking, well, who am I dealing with here? This company's got a bit of an identity crisis, and you see it all the time, you hear it all the time.
Or it's smoke and mirrors.
At
the end of the day, the marketing team have been creative with how they position the brand, and that's not reflected in how a salesperson does. You would assume that what the marketing team are promoting is the falsified or the kind of fake or
the desired position.
The selling the dream sort of thing.
Yeah.
And the salesperson's is the reality, isn't it?
Yeah. But we hear it all the time because we work on a lot of websites, and we hear all the time that what's the main driver for you to update your website? Well, it's really fallen behind in terms of reflecting what we actually do. No longer does that. Some companies will happily tick along in that kind of state, but that's a real risk because it's not just a risk; it's a missed opportunity. But what you're doing is having a website live that is creating doubt in the minds of your potential buyers.
Doesn't take much to understand the psychology behind that either, does it? You know, if you have a salesperson at the end of the phone trying to sell you service B, and on the website that isn't featured, you would naturally assume that either the capability in that area is lesser than the core services represented on the website, or that it's been made up, or that, you know, that the business doesn't really offer that service, not as a core capability anyway.
Yeah, and there's all these inconsistencies that manifest themselves in the buying process, and I think, you know, it can be scary to think, okay, we need to sit down and really understand our buyer journey and the different touch points they go through, the different information needs at each stage. But if you don't do that, there are obviously going to be lots of gaps, and you'll only really see those gaps when you really lay out the journey in full, and you'll only see the opportunities to really engage your buyers at the right points when you really map it out in some detail.
Well, that can be overwhelming though, can't it? And I think that's probably what stops people from doing it. Obviously, if you've got a multi-stage, non-linear buyer journey with a complex sale, high value, high risk, multiple stakeholders, and you have to try and account for all of those different information needs throughout every stage of that journey, those gaps are going to be quite considerable.
It's maybe not as scary as you think, but I think in the absence of having an understanding of the buyer journey, you're inevitably going to have these gaps, and there's a real danger that you're going to be turning people off.
And it's not just about the gaps, is it? I think you can move forward knowing there's some gaps there, as long as what you are producing is coherently produced, or is produced with, you know, a structure and a connection to the next stage in the process in mind. So if you know you have, and I think the average is 6 and 10 different stakeholders or decision makers within a B2B complex buying journey, most people aren't going to be able to cover all of those spaces. But if you can prioritize 2 of those stakeholders and identify them by mapping your buying journey, and therefore create content and design processes and design experiences that work within that buyer journey rather than disregarding it altogether, then that's a damn sight better than not mapping the buyer journey at all.
Yeah. And I also think that if you think about those different buyers, they might come at things from different perspectives, but
and with different levels of influence.
Yeah, but they'll still have some common areas that they'll be looking to understand. So I think we're going to come back to how you can actually formulate your buyer journey and the steps you can go through shortly. But before we do, I think it's important just to frame this problem in a little bit more detail and get back to how we believe that if you've got a very digital only set of engagements, or
primarily digital only,
at the early stage of the buying process, and again at the latter stages you've got a purely human only set of interactions, then again there's a missed opportunity there. And I think there was some Gartner research that was done recently that showed when buyers are going through a digital only buying process, there's a much higher chance of regret at the end of that, buyer's regret at the end of that process. That is significantly reduced if they go through a process and it's a combination of digital and a sales rep involved in that process. In terms of digital, obviously providing information in a way that's easy to consume, but every buyer is overwhelmed with information. So when you have an expert that can guide you through that, it brings everything to life, and it's a lot more easy to understand. And a very simple example of how the two come together would be a product demo online. There's other examples that we're going to give today, but let's start with simple examples. There's 2 options that some companies, software companies, might embark on when they're trying to show their software. They use canned demos that can be virtual demos
or free trials.
And it's incumbent then on the buyer to actually try and figure out how that works. It's much stronger when you've got a human being who's an expert and using that technology to guide you through.
The interesting thing in that Gartner research, though, is that 75% of buyers said they prefer a completely humanless, sales repless process. So clearly there's a demand there for buyers to self-serve, but that's not translating into satisfaction with the service. And, you know, you can see why. And I think what we should also point out is that in literally all of the buying journeys that we're talking about here, where they're complex, multi-stakeholder, high value, it's impossible to have a completely technology-led approach to sales.
So the Gartner research does contradict itself, and it, you know, it's open about that. On the one hand, it's showing that buyers do prefer to go through a self-service process, a digital-only process as much as possible. But on the flip side, it also says that when they do that, there's a higher degree of buyer remorse.
I'm not sure that really means it contradicts itself. I just think it means that where people are doing it themselves, they're less likely to make the right decision.
Well, I think they, you know, got to put it into context. I imagine that what they're referring to is lower value transactional sales, so probably more SaaS products that you find the pricing online, and it's quite an easy.
Well, that's the point, though, isn't it? It's also really, it's often, I nearly said it, often quite cheap, often really quick to go through that process. And so if you can skate through it, then of course more people are going to regret that. You know, you could sign up to an app in 2 minutes and be a bit impulsive about it. I think when a longer, complex buyer journey, multiple stages, etc., you've got more time to consider that purchase, more time to reflect, more time to back out if you don't think it's right. And of course, that means that you're going to regret them less.
So the key point is that when it's a combination of digital and a human being actually helping you through the sales process, providing expertise, providing guidance, that remorse reduces, and you're going to end up with a solution that is closer to what you want. And I think that becomes even more paramount and even more important the more complex the sales process is, the higher value the actual procurement process is, or the actual thing you're buying is, the higher risk that comes into play in terms of the decision-making process. And just as those things increase, obviously the need to have both increases at the same rate. So I think that's really what the research is saying. Well, that's how I interpret it. So from a complex sales perspective, it really says that it's not about digital only, it's not about human only. It really, really comes together when you can combine the two.
And combine the two in the right way. I think that's an important thing, because all of the complex sales journeys or buyer journeys that we're part of have some level of human and some level of digital interaction. Very rarely do we see one or the other. Certainly we don't see any completely digital complex buyer journeys, because I think that's impossible for something that's
such a
high
considered
value,
purchase.
such a considered purchase. But we do see differing levels of interaction from digital and from the human side. And I think it's more about getting that right balance, but also timing, because I think we see quite a lot that sometimes there will be maybe, let's just say in this case, a digital asset like a buyer's guide or a business case guide or some form of content, a webinar, whatever it may be, which is intended to facilitate the early stages of the sales process or the buyer journey, consideration, decision, purchase. I know it's a bit more complex than that, but a bridge version. And a person engages with that, and a salesperson straight on the phone and trying to sell to someone that's only shown some tentative, speculative interest in what they've got to say. And that's an example of poor timing in terms of that transition between digital and human. And where tech really helps, I think, in this process is not just the facilitation of providing that information in the earlier stages in guides, content, etc., but also the data that enables you to transition at the right time. So if we look at things like buyer intent data or lead scoring even, and workflows, sales to marketing, sales handoff workflows, those can all be configured quite cleverly so that that handoff process only happens at a point at which you can be more confident that that person is ready to engage with a salesperson. Because we know that most want to take it as far as they can before they have to do that. And if you're going before that, before they're ready for it, before they want it, you can do more harm than good.
Yeah, because ultimately people want to self-serve, because as soon as they make that move towards a salesperson and the salesperson engages, they've put themselves in a situation where they probably feel they're going to get hounded, and they're not.
It's fucking annoying, isn't it? We've all had that, when you've maybe downloaded something speculatively and then you don't get emails time and time again for the next 3 weeks, people phoning you up.
You just don't want it if you're not ready for that. If you're at the early stage of your buying process, you're not ready for that. But when on the flip side, when you are further down the buying process, you want the support.
Of course you do. And if you don't get it, someone else is going to do it.
And then you can even go the other way where you don't feel you're getting enough time, and therefore you're going to probably end up going with the organisation that is giving you the most value, the most time from an expert.
And I don't think it's just about the effectiveness of the process, i.e. the ability to get people converting and ultimately buying from you. If you think about the impact that has on sales and marketing teams, for example, and we should probably look at both effectiveness and efficiency. Because if we look at efficiency within the process, that's what's driving a lot of push towards automation and heavily digitizing processes, digital transformation in buzzwordy terms, that previously humans did. And there's good reason for it, because of course, with heavily manual marketing and sales processes for that matter, sales and marketing teams are going to struggle to scale. Things are going to go slowly. Things are going to fall through the cracks. So there's a big use case there, which improves efficiency from a digital perspective. But on the other hand, in the scenario that I've just talked through, in terms of the salesperson reaching out too early and then reaching out again and continually trying to chase a lead which was never there and never ready to engage, that's also really inefficient from a salesperson's time, and ineffective for that matter. So finding that balance isn't just about increasing the chances of conversion. It's about spending your team's time wisely on the right deals at the right time.
Yeah. And this is the frustration I have, that you constantly see on LinkedIn, wherever, that you've got these new approaches to marketing, these new approaches to lead generation. Really, if people actually just fixed what they're doing already and had a more structured strategy and more structured processes, they would be far more effective and they would be more efficient. It's not about completely reinventing the wheel and starting doing something new that no one's ever thought of before. Just, there absolutely are no silver bullets. And it goes back to the earlier point. If you do really understand your buyer journey, and you can start to think about how you optimize each stage through digital and human and the combination of both, that's when you will start to iron out all the gaps, make the most of the opportunities that are there, and that's when you'll start to see you are more effective and equally more efficient. I mean, I think there was some research from Simon Kucher that suggested that B2B sales teams in complex sales, they only actually spend around 30 to 35% of their time on actually selling. There's a gross inefficiency there. The rest of their time is on admin. The rest of their time is on maybe updating CRM. The rest of the time is spent on coordinating with delivery or just processing orders. A lot of that can be digitized. A lot of that can be, CRM, the entry into CRM can be digitized and automated. So there's lots of opportunities to get the sales guys selling more.
But like I said earlier, I think that the point is, if we were able to free up that time for a greater efficiency, ensuring that the right people are being targeted at the right time is also important, because you'd free up 30% more of a salesperson's time for them to go and bang on closed doors. It's not going to be effective, is it? So it's about using tech to enable that increased efficiency and free up time for sales and marketing teams to do more valuable activity, but also using the data that tech surfaces to point them in the right direction.
So we jumped around in terms of framing the problem. I think I'm keen to give those that are listening to this or watching this just a bit of a framework to start thinking about this in a more structured way. So, and again, the starting point is to really understand your buyer journey. So that would be step one. So what are the typical stages in a buyer journey? And probably the starting point, if it's not that clear, is to use the classic Gartner stages. I think there's probably 6 or 7, starting with status quo, where your buyers are inactive, not even buyers at that stage, they're just merely prospects, right the way through to, from problem identification to solution evaluation and actually supplier evaluation and decision, etc. So we may come back to that, but I think that understanding that is the first stage. There's various ways you can do that, starting with the basic framework from Gartner. It could be, talking to customers, obviously talking to the sales team, making sure marketing and sales are aligned, they fully understand it. There's customer journey analytics that you can work with, Sankey charts and waterfall charts that you can use through CRM, through your interactions on your website and the touch points online through HubSpot. So there are ways that you can do it. You can even use tools like Hotjar to look at heat maps and how people are interacting with your site. There are the tools there that can enable you to do that, and it doesn't need to be overly complex. Just starting with the Gartner stages is a great start.
Let's be honest, most B2B complex sales are going to be very close to that, if not exactly as Gartner described.
Stages are the same, but it's just the fact that people don't move through that linear process. They move all around. I think as Gartner used the phrase, it's not a linear process, it's more like a spaghetti bowl. And it is complex and people are moving, in all directions. You can only manage so many elements of that. So that's the first step. I think the second step is to really think about the touch points that are at each stage of the buyer journey. So whether that's both digital and human touch points. So you've got at the very early stages, it might be LinkedIn, for example, as a touch point. Your website is a touch point. From a human perspective, the discovery call is often the first touch point, or it could be a BDR outreach or whatever it is. I think once you've understood those different touch points from a buyer's perspective, that's when you can start to see where there may be some gaps. Third stage would be to really then think about the different stakeholders involved and what their information needs are at each stage. So when it's very early on, it's that whole value framing piece where value framing, again, in Gartner's terms, is really where the buyer is trying to understand how the solution can help them solve a particular problem and what value it brings. Later in the process, it's much more about what they call value affirmation, which is how they then assess whether you're the right fit, whether they can trust you to deliver on what you say you can deliver. So again, if you've got inconsistencies throughout that process, that buying process, then that's where doubt's going to creep in, and that's where you start to lose the opportunity, or may not even get it in the first place. Because if people are evaluating your website really early on, before they even draw up a shortlist, then you're not going to make that shortlist if what you're saying is inconsistent, or worse. Often we work with companies where their proposition is really strong, it just hasn't been presented on its website in the right way. So you could absolutely deliver for a client that's looking for the problem that you can fix and probably better at it than anyone else, but they rule you out because what they've seen on your website, not a fit. So after you've got and understand the journey, you've looked at the touch points, you've looked at the content, it's then around thinking about how you can combine digital and humans in the process. So a great example for me is ThoughtWorks and the Tech Radar that they've been producing now for, I think, probably about 10 years. That covers off various stages of the buying process, more at the top end of the funnel. So they really focus to begin with on the status quo, where you've got inactive buyers. Their main interest is making sure they're on top of industry trends and maybe trying to find ways to solve problems that they think they can do themselves rather than having an external vendor or supplier support them. So it produces the Tech Radar, which shows the next wave of technology that's coming through. Really, really insightful. But as you progress through that, there's interactive tools you can use. There's webinars you can attend. There's events you can go to. And then they do sessions with individual experts that can talk you through those different technologies and how they may be able to help and how they should be on your roadmap. So it's a really great way of using one kind of idea to engage in many different ways, combining humans and digital in the process. And then the final stage for me is that you should assess all of that, but then in terms of how you start to action it and build it, you start at the end. I think there's too many, certainly marketers, that focus on the top of the funnel. And then what you end up doing is attracting organisations or buyers to maybe your website or other areas of the funnel that aren't at the latter stages that aren't really built to convert.
Well, you end up with this big void, don't you? And we've seen a good example of that actually is not having a BDR team in place. And if we look at the digital versus the human interaction, one issue that we see time and time again is that we might see really effective marketing people that garner a lot of attention through top of the funnel content, webinars, guides, events, whatever. And we might see really effective sales teams which are great at closing deals. But both from a content and from a people perspective or from an information perspective, there's sometimes that massive void. So if you start at the end and work backwards, you cover all of those stages, including the middle, which is often the missing bit for me.
Yeah.
You know, the buyer enablement content is often neglected or underdeveloped within a marketing process. Buyer enablement content is often neglected or underdeveloped by marketers who focus on top of the funnel stuff. Salespeople at the other end, the human end of the spectrum or the process, want to focus on qualified opportunities rather than prospecting. And so there's two things there which are often missing in the middle bit of the buyer journey, which is buyer enablement content and from a human perspective, BDR support.
So then the fifth stage for me is to really start to build all this out, but start at the end of the process, not at the beginning. I think it's a mistake to start thinking about attracting visitors, traffic to a website that doesn't bear any resemblance to what you actually offer. I mean, and I know the website interaction is still further up the chain, but ultimately you've got to make sure that what you're actually selling is in an optimal state before you start trying to drive.
Also, if you start at the end, it means that you can't neglect those middle stages, because you're right in saying that, if you focus too heavily on attracting traffic, you bring a lot of traffic, but not all the right people. But equally, it's important to give those people somewhere to go next. So without buyer enablement content, calculators, digital experiences, quoting tools, etc., you're giving them limited opportunity to move forward in that process themselves, which we know from the research with Gartner people want to do. And if they can do that elsewhere, then they're going to. At the end of the day, there's a good example from the SaaS world, which is not necessarily relevant to this, but it highlights the point in that if a SaaS provider doesn't provide a price, most people will just leave the site straight away and go to another that does. And it's the same concept. Ultimately, they want to go as far as they can in their understanding of that business, in their consideration of it, and their analysis of it against their own needs. And if you're starting at the end of that buyer journey and working back, you're going to make sure that you cover in that middle and bottom of the funnel content that is so often neglected by marketing teams that want to focus on content which is going to bring more numbers through the door, because ultimately that's what they're measured on. More traffic, more webinar attendances, whatever it may be.
If you start at the end, the end is where most of the investment has gone. That's where, you've got the sales functions will have, whether it's bid materials or responses to RFPs or, major proposals and all the important stuff that's going to ultimately close the deal. Most of that's going to be there already. And then working back, at that point, it's maybe considering where it can be enhanced by digital. I remember working with a client that was had a major opportunity. I think it was 10, 15 million, and it was a bit more of an ABM approach, but it was quite, towards the end of the sales process, but they'd gone into that kind of closed period where they're down to the final two, making a decision. You can still influence them at that point, even though you can't directly interact with them because they say, look, we're not going to speak to you now.
But you can make it easier for them.
Well, we got their, most of the buying team on a webinar just because it's relevant in that particular closed window, which is still using a digital means of actually interacting with them and influencing them.
Well, there's other digital means that are maybe less fancy and less sexy, but still are powerful, I think, in the process. If you think about the digitization of sales tools at the bottom of the funnel, it's even things like making the sign-in process really easy and making the quoting process really easy using digital tools, which, of course, have been around for a long time, but then, not everyone uses them. They can still be a differentiator. it's also about making that process as easy as possible through digitization. That means that they can sail through it seamlessly without loads of barriers in the way.
Yeah. What you find in most organisations is the bottom of the funnel is pretty well thought through with all the assets in the right place. And then top of the funnel, lots of activity. And it really comes down to how marketing and sales are measured. That's it, and the gap is in the middle, and that there's always a gap in the middle. And this is where it's so important that marketing and sales align, because when they do that, that all important. Because if you can really improve conversion in the middle stages of the funnel, then it's going to have a huge impact.
There's normally a gap in content, in tech, and in people. I don't want it to come across as if we're saying just because people prefer digital interaction as much as possible in the sales journey that there isn't a place for humans in that middle stage. I think there absolutely is. And we see really regularly that you might have a high-performing marketing team and a high-performing sales team, but you're lacking the bridge in the BDR function that connects the two together and brings prospects through from a digital interaction at an early stage through to that later stage appointment. And that's so often missing because salespeople don't want to prospect. People are very reluctant often to follow up a list of 100 event leads or something like that, because 90% of them are going to be not ready to buy, or 95% if you follow the 95-5 rule, and 5% are. So there's that BDR function, I think, is a really important missing piece for most people, as well as buyer enablement content and the kind of digital tech at that stage of the process that makes the whole thing seamless.
Yeah. Well, again, it's that those interventions aren't necessarily restricted to one point in the buyer journey. A BDR ideally would come in at a stage where the buyer has just become a buyer, or they're just embarking on a particular project. But you've had the luxury of influencing them in the sort of non-active status quo stage through thought leadership and making sure they're aware of your brand. That would be the perfect kind of entry point. And then that may lead to a discovery call. And then you're starting to really shape the buyer's thinking through that sales process. But then it is about, okay, so what digital tools can the sales people use as they go through problem identification into solution exploration? How can the two combine to really make that stage of the process more effective and increase conversions? So I think there's lots of ways of doing that with diagnostic tools, assessments, but then again, if they're just left to the buyer to do this in isolation on their own without any guidance, that's when they're maybe less effective. So it's really thinking about how your sales team can interact with that by providing some value, whether it's a business case builder, whether they talk that through a some kind of Zoom call or whatever it is. You're interacting both digitally and with the human, just to enhance that experience. And the sales experience is ultimately what differentiates you in those stages. So let's wrap up. We've talked through a lot. It's quite a complicated subject. It certainly can appear that way at face value, and that's part of the problem. I think for a lot of people, it can be a bit scary. But I think what we're really trying to advocate is that you should really start with your buyer. Really start by understanding the steps they go through in their buying process, and then really thinking about the value that you can provide at each stage, rather than what many do, which is think about, how can we get engagement with them? How can we sell to them? I think that is obviously a really critical component, but if you don't start with the buyer, you don't understand the value that you need to provide them. You don't understand what they're looking for in terms of information, what they need to make assessments, to do the value framing piece, to do the value affirmation. If you don't understand any of that, you're going to be ineffective.
And likely inefficient.
Yeah. It's really about starting there, and then you can start to think about how you use those interactions to leverage your conversion and optimize your conversion.
Well, it's about mapping your activity to those buyer stages and the information needs at each of them at the end of the day. It may be that you're already doing a lot of those things and you can map your activity to them at the right time, but it may be that there are some gaps that you then need to fill. So I think there's two things there. It's understanding your buying journey, mapping your activity to that buying journey and the information needs throughout it. I think one of the important summary points for me is ensuring that your technology enables that transition between human and digital at the right time. And there's loads of ways you can do that. So that's an important thing, I think, to add.
Give an example.
Yeah, I gave one earlier, around the fact that when you understand the buyer journey properly, you understand that in the early stages of the buyer journey, a salesperson's outreach is likely to be ineffective. It's different for every business, but determining when someone is at a different stage of the buyer journey, which would mean that outreach is more effective, is a really important step to take. Lead scoring, etc., like I said earlier, is a really good way of doing that. Buyer intent data is probably better. But if you can start to spot trends in when your salespeople are more effective with their outreach based upon the level of engagement, and only trigger that engagement at that point, then you can be much more effective without wasting your salesperson's time.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on an important point that I think people may be using tools like buyer intent, lead scoring, but not in the context of the buyer journey. It's just let's leverage buyer intent, let's score leads. Yeah. But that's the starting point. That should never be the starting point. No. The strategy, the buyer journey should come first, and then it's about how you utilize those tools.
You use that data point to understand where they're at on the buyer journey. And if you can't say, and it's not an exact science, but if you can't say, when someone reaches this stage, we at least predict that they're at the consideration stage or the solution evaluation stage, then you're merely responding to them based upon a quantity of engagement, not necessarily what that tells you about where they are and what the most effective step is to take as a result. It may not be that a really kind of straight to the jugular salesperson outreach is effective at that stage still. It may be that you enroll them in a nurture sequence at that point, a more intensive nurture sequence to get them even further. But the point that we're trying to make is that without understanding that buyer journey, you cannot configure and optimize your activity to make that buyer journey work seamlessly for the buyer and make it more effective for your sales and marketing team.
It is every particular channel, piece of content that if you were to evaluate it and really assess whether it has any impact on the buyer journey, or it's obviously been configured to support that or been created to support that. Website is another classic example. Most websites in B2B follow the same structure: homepage, services page. Very few actually have a mechanism to guide people down a particular conversion path in line with the buyer journey. That it's not even considered. So it's just another example of where, by starting with the buyer journey, you can be far, far more effective. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to our podcast on your favourite podcasting channel. And if you enjoyed this episode, then do us a solid and leave a review and a rating. If you want more insights and resources, head over to romy-associates.com. We'll see you next time.